or tactical team.
Hey there guys, this is me, Malorian, and this is another Orc Tactical Team. And today, we're going to be talking about terrain for idiots. And what I mean by that is that Steamroller 2017 just came out, and there is a lot of words in there talking about terrain. And there's a lot of people who are getting kind of concerned about it. I mean, you look at the package and there's all these rules about this has to be like this and this has to be like that, and then there's all these different terrain methods, and there's a lot of people wondering, okay, I host games. What am I expected to actually set up on here so that, I'm doing it right? And there's a lot of tournament organizers saying, whoa, I run official events. What do I have to do for my event? Or even tournament organizers who run just friendly steamrollers. Okay, well, what should I be doing? And then even the players saying, all right, I want to go into this event and do well, and I need to know what terrain to expect so that I can prepare for it. So what I want to talk about today is starting with how it breaks down and what it really means you have to do, and then I'm going to move to the next stage and talk about what you should do. So let's first talk about what you have to do. Now, if you read the Steamroller 2017 package, there's really two parts to it. Part of it is what you have to do. So these are all the things that say blah, 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 must, blah, 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 blah. Those are things you have to do. So here's one of them. Terrain must be more than 6 inches than any board edge. Okay, that's easy. Terrain must be at least 2 inches apart from other terrain, unless they're trenches. Okay, that makes sense. Restricted terrain. And of course, restricted terrain are the things like obstructions and walls. Those things have to be at least 5 inches apart. Basically just so a colossal can walk through. So those are the things you have to do. I believe there's also restricted terrain is not allowed in deployment zones. If you're doing that, you're probably a jerk anyway. But that's the stuff you have to do. And then you're probably saying, well, Malorian, there's all this other stuff in here. What are you talking about? All those other things, those are guidelines. Those are just suggestions. And one of the things that made this abundantly clear, I mean, if you're not, my job is in compliance. I read these things, and if it doesn't say must, it's just a suggestion. And it was very nice that Will Hungerford came on to the Advanced Maneuvers podcast and really explained that, yeah, going into this, we had a lot of different TOs or new players who would be calling in, writing in, whatever, trying to get guidance, saying, hey, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. Can you give me a map or some rules of how I do terrain? And the thing is that Privateer Press did not want to be restricted. They didn't want to say like, okay, put one wall 16 inches up and 14 inches from the side, right? Like, they don't want to get into that type of thing. So this is the best step they could do, was putting out these suggestions and really taking the experience from knowledgeable players saying, hey, these are the methods I use. Here are all these different ones as an option to you. Go ahead. And so you really now must go and read that package and really just take it with, I don't know, a grain of salt's not really the right phrase, but just the understanding that these are all suggestions and guidance, more so for players who are uncertain of how to actually play terrain. So really, that's the part there. There's the what you must do, and everything else is just the should. Now, I want to say for my own part, I have probably been running tournaments for longer than some of my viewers have actually been alive. That's kind of crazy and kind of scary at the same time, but I'm actually very certain that's true. And so over the years, I have deployed terrain in many different ways, some of them turning out to be good, some of them turning out to be bad. I've learned my lessons as I went through, and now I feel like I am an experienced tournament organizer, and I have no problem just walking in and setting things up. And so I thought I would then now go into this and make it more of how does Malorian do terrain. And again, when it comes to you or the tournament organizers around you, they're going to have their own way. But if you're a person who's looking for guidance, this is the way that I have found works the best, and it kind of matches with a lot of things which is in that package there. So maybe this will get a good idea from an experienced player and TO and kind of showing the reasoning and getting it across to you. So the first thing I like to do is I look at the center of the board. And what I want to do at the center of the board is I want to put in something significant there. In the case of War Machine, the two pieces that really matter the most are either going to be like a building, a big obstruction, or also a forest. And the big thing between these two things is that one, they block line of sight, and two, they interfere with movement. And that is super, super key. And what it really comes down to is gun lines. If you have someone who can just sit there and say like, I can see the world, well then that's awesome. I'm just going to sit back here and shoot for days. Or if you're someone who has a really long threat range, hey, the world's my oyster, I'm sitting right here, and maybe I even have Pathfinder innately, so yeah, if I can see you, zoom, I go out. So the addition of something like a forest or a building really helps break that up, and then makes it so it's going to be a more dynamic game. It's not just I'm going to place down my dice or my models and then roll dice, or I'm going to put down my things and then charge you once you're in range. It's more so I'm going to have to position around this, I'm going to have to move over here, and it just makes it a lot more interesting. Now, at the same time, learning from my mistakes, one of the things you really don't want to do is make it too significant. Now, what I mean by that is that I played in a game where there was a massive forest in the middle of the board. And we're talking about something that's like 12 inches diameter. It was ridiculous. And of course, I was up against Legion, so they didn't care about it. And that's the big thing you have to remember, is that significance of terrain is going to depend heavily on who actually is at that table, right? Different models have different rules. Some can ignore some parts. Some are really heavily affected by others. And so if you go really big on one type, it's going to have a really big effect on the game. And even though you could say like, oh, well, at least it's going to hurt both sides equally, it won't. And so the more significant you make it, the bigger that disparity is going to be, and you really have to watch out for that. So that's why in the package, if you read it, it suggests that everything is at a size of somewhere between 3 inches to 6 inches, and that's a really great way to, use as a guidance and place things down. If you have something that's 7 inches or 8 inches, sure, whatever, but I mean the main thing they're getting at is don't put a massive mountain in the middle of the board or a massive water or anything like that, because it's just really going to throw off and skew the game. Plus, you'll also see that if you put things a little bit too big and too significant on the board, the more larger some of those more significant pieces are, the harder it is to work around the scenario. Because as you start putting down flags and zones and stuff like that, it starts to get really messy when you got these really big forests or really significant defensive positions. Decisions. So there's that part. So that's step one. I'm looking at the middle of the board and I'm making it significant. And that's been a long talk. I've been talking about this for a little while, but it's absolutely key. The second thing that you want to be key is making sure that each side of that table has something defensive to it. This is a game where you can win by assassination, and so it's really important that there's something there. You don't want it to be so like, oh, I am running all the guns, I'm forcing you to that side has nothing defensive, guess you're dead. That's not what you want. And so for those cases there, again, a forest can work because you can give concealment and block line of sight. You can look to buildings again, obstructions. You could be looking at walls. You could be looking at rubble. Any of these things, a trench, but you want something on each side. Now, while you get into this, this is probably the time as well that you want to make sure that things are not symmetrical. Because at this step, it's very easy to say, oh, I want something defensive on either side. I'm going to put a trench here, and I'm going to put a trench here. There you go. Both sides are happy. You want to make the choice of side important. that's part of the reason why you roll for who's going first, and why whoever's not is going first is picking sides. It's supposed to be part of the game, and it's supposed to be significant to be able to say like, ooh, I want to be using this side of the board to leverage this terrain, or to be forcing this terrain on you. And if it's a mirror, if both sides of the board are exactly the same, that means nothing. So you really can't do that. You need to make sure that they're significantly different on both sides. And so while you're doing that, you might want to say that on this side over here, I'm going to put a trench, and a trench is awesome. On the other side, I'm going to put a wall, but I'm going to put it more off to the side, so sure, you have something defensive, but you're kind of moving away from the battle line. Or maybe it's something where it's further back, and you're saying, okay, well, you can go to that wall, but you're going to kill box yourself. It's still an option, but it's like that. And I mean, that's maybe a little bit more mean, and you probably don't want to go that route, but the thing is you want it to be a decision for the players when they're picking what side they want for going first or second or anything like that. And as well, feel free to make one side stronger than the other, right? It's not like, oh, I need to have one here and one here so that everything is equal, even if it's not symmetrical. At the same time, you also want to make it so that different sides will have an advantage. So in one way, it was kind of like I was saying, where there's like a perfect trench in the middle, and then there's a wall off to the side. That kind of gets to what I'm saying. But what you could also do is like, well, on this side, there's that trench, and that's okay. But on the other side, they have a trench and a wall. So there's a lot more defensive pieces over there. And depending on what you're going for a scenario, depending on how many pieces you need to keep safe, all of a sudden that stuff can become a lot more important. Of course, again, you want these things to be different, because if you just say wall, 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 wall everywhere, you know, the difference between what a trench does and a wall does is very big, right? Not all things can charge over a wall, whereas you can just charge over a trench. You can't just stop on a wall, but you can just stop on a trench. So you want these things to be different, and you want one side to have an advantage, but not too much of an advantage, right? You don't want to be like, well, on this side, I'm going to have a little piece of rubble, and on the other side, trenches for days, because that's just not going to be fair, and you're not going to be making any friends. So be careful not to do that as well. It's just like that middle piece where we said, don't make it too significant. The advantage of picking sides, don't make that too significant either. Now, at this point here, you should have about 1 to 2 pieces somewhere in the center, and each side should be having their own defense stuff. So we're probably at this point somewhere between, 3 on the low side to being more so like 5 or 6 for pieces of terrain that's already on the board. And that's still going to be low, right? There's still more of the board we haven't used. So what do? You just start putting stuff in it. And while you're doing that, I mean, you're making sure to mix things up. Like, I'm going to put a hill over here. I'm going to put some water over here. I'm going to go and then throw another trench over here. And I'll say from this part, having defensive pieces near the middle of the board makes for something completely more interesting, because all of a sudden it's an idea of like, well, I have something safe here, but if I can make it to that defensive piece in the middle, it's great for board position. So don't feel like you can't put a trench or a wall somewhere in the middle of the board. Those things are all perfect. At the same time, while you're trying to fill in these empty spaces, well, make sure you're not blocking people off. And what I mean by that is if you started off and it's like, well, I'm going to be putting this forest over here and this building over here, and then when you keep on placing things, you're like, well, on the other side of the forest, I'll put another building, and then it turns out from one side, if they don't have Pathfinder, they're going to have a hard time going around these 2 buildings in this forest to become a part of the game. So watch for those. You don't want one side to be really penned in and not able to really get into the game and have fun. So make sure there's enough room in there for people to get around with their models, but at the same time, you can restrict them a little bit. So at the end of that, that's going to be really it. You're going to start with the center, make sure the center is something that breaks up line of sight and movement. You're going to make sure each side has something defensive, and you're already looking at making things not symmetrical. Then you're going to be looking at all the opened areas around and throwing in pieces in there, and yeah, that's really it. And I mean, a lot of people will go in and be like, well, you got to make sure you got your 8 pieces. Well, 8 pieces are great, but again, it's more about what you're after. I see no problem with it if you're going for 6 pieces, especially if they're larger, right? If you have a forest, which is not 6 inches or 3 inches, but is actually more like the 8 inches or something, yeah, that kind of counts as 2 pieces of terrain when you're kind of thinking that, when you're thinking about like board coverage. So keep that in mind. Or at the same time, if a lot of your pieces of terrain are like a small hill here and a small wall there, well, those things don't really cover up a lot of the board, and you might want to go a little bit heavier. At the end of the day, you just want something that will give a dynamic and tactically interesting situation on the board. And you can also change things as you're going from board to board to board. It's not like you set up your one perfect terrain setup and then just copy and paste, copy and paste. Make them a little bit different. Make sure that if there's one Legion player that's loving all this forest, or a Circle player that, well, okay, we don't always go with like one building and one forest in the middle of every board. Sometimes, you'll do that. Other times it'll be 2 forests. Sometimes it's just one building, whatever it is, but make sure to keep these things different, right? And maybe in this one here, maybe one of the boards, there's a building, but it's more off to the side, so the middle is a little bit more open. You can have that, and that's okay. And I think at the end of the day, what is the most important is listen to your players, because you as a tournament organizer or as a host of gaming days, you will have it in your mind that this is the way that you want to play. You read the guidance documents, you have your experience, and you're like, yep, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to place the things down. Well, it turns out you're not the only person there, and you're not by far the most important person there, so make sure you're listening to others, right? If you change and you decide like, ooh, I'm going to try doing terrain like this, ask people. Say like, hey, what did you think about that terrain I put down? And if people are coming back to you and saying, buddy, you are putting down way too much terrain, or you know what, it'd be a little bit more interesting if you put a few more buildings down there to break things up. Listen to your players, listen to the people that you're playing with, because if everyone's having more fun, that's really what this is all about. This is the reason why Privateer Press didn't want to make these things solid, you have to do rules, and made them as guidance, so that every group, which is different from the other groups, can have the terrain they want it to be for them. Hell, you might have some group where they're like, you know what, terrain sucks, I just want to play with an empty board. Sure, whatever, if that's what you guys think is fun, that's fantastic. I'm guessing most people aren't like that, but it's all about you guys. So there you guys go. There is Terrain for Idiots. Hopefully you learned something, and if there's something that you want to add to it, or if there's something you disagree with, please post it down below. That's what these orc tactical teams are all about. And otherwise, I'll catch you later. Bye.